Wnba fining and suspending
WNBA star Caitlin Clark now speaking out.
Caitlin Clark just did something only 4 other players in basketball history have ever done. 45 points. 10 assists. A defensive stat line that puts her next to the legends. And just 24 hours later, she was one step closer to a suspension. That's a wild swing. From a historic game to a disputed technical foul. And it didn't come out of nowhere. It goes back to a borderline call in June, one the league chose not to take back. Fans have been keeping track ever since. So was Saturday's technical really about a screen she never saw coming? Or is this part of something bigger, something that's been building for months? Let's look at the facts and connect the dots. From record books to referee whistles. Let's start with Friday night. The numbers speak for themselves. 45 points. 10 assists. And on defense, she was everywhere, blocks, steals, forcing turnovers left and right. Johnson tried to hold onto the ball. Clark ripped it away. That's the kind of stat line only a handful of players, men or women, have ever put up in one game. And get this, she did it all while still playing under a minute's restriction. Under 30 minutes on the court. That's it. Analysts started comparing her to Michael Jordan. Luka Doncic's name came up too. Social media basically ran out of words to describe what they just watched. Can a night like that be overhyped? Barely. Only 4 other players, ever, in the whole history of pro basketball, have matched a stat line this rare. For one night, basketball fans everywhere were only talking about one thing, what Clark had just done, what it meant for the history books, and where her career was heading next. That conversation didn't even last a full day. Here's the detail that really stands out. Clark pulled this off while still under a minute's limit, one her team put in place months ago because of an earlier injury. Normally, a restricted player doesn't have a career best night. Those two things don't usually go together. But she did it anyway. Which makes you wonder, if she can do this while being held back, what happens when she's not? The league didn't get much time to sit with that question. Because everything changed fast. Just 90 seconds into Indiana's next game, against the New York Liberty, Clark ran into a hard screen and hit the ground. She looked up, expecting a foul call. Nothing. She got up, said a few words to the nearest ref, and got hit with a technical, before the game had barely even started. Her 6th of the season. Plus a $1,000 fine. So why does a missed call in the opening minutes matter so much? Because this wasn't just one bad whistle. It was one more bad whistle stacked on top of a pattern fans and media have been watching closely all season. As for the game itself? Easy win for Indiana. They beat a Liberty team that had actually beaten them earlier this season. Final score 108-88. Kelsey Mitchell dropped 33 points.
Just another year of the team being together.
For a team sitting at 15 wins and 10 losses, still fighting for a playoff spot in a tough conference, that win mattered. But you'd barely know it from the coverage. What everyone talked about instead was the technical, the fine, and the math behind it. 2 more technicals, and she's looking at a mandatory 1-game suspension. 6 down. 3 to go. Think about that. One of the team's best wins in weeks, and it got completely overshadowed by a single disputed call. That says less about the win itself and more about how closely people are now watching, counting, and talking about every single technical Clark picks up, like it's its own story. So was this just an overreaction to one weekend? Or does it fit something bigger that's been building for a while? The evidence says it's the second one. And to understand how it started, we've got to go back to a much quieter game, several months earlier. Here's something worth pointing out. How fast that record-breaking performance just vanished from the headlines. A stat line like that, one only a few players in history have ever matched, should have been the story for days. Instead, by the very next afternoon, everyone had already moved on to talking about the fine and the suspension countdown. That speed says a lot. It means this wasn't just a technical foul making news on its own. It was slotting right into a story that's been building for months, one where every new disciplinary call gets treated as bigger and more important than whatever just happened on the court. The technical that changed everything. To understand why one non-call on a random Saturday carried so much weight, you have to rewind all the way back to June. In a game against the Phoenix Mercury, Clark picked up a technical foul, one that a lot of people watching at the time
Came just 2 days after another physical matchup between the Fever and Mercury, which featured several technical fouls and an ejection.
people called it borderline at best. The kind of frustrated, physical moment refs usually just let go, and something most fans would have forgotten in a week. But this one didn't go away. After a formal review, the NBA actually upheld the technical instead of taking it back. What made that stand out? Around the same time, similar calls involving other players had been overturned. So why would the league stick with this one call, but reverse others just like it? That's the real question here. And it's exactly what turned a routine officiating decision into something much bigger. It's not that one technical foul is a huge deal on its own. It's what that decision seemed to say about how Clark was being treated compared to everyone else on the court. And decisions like that tend to stick, whether the league means for them to or not. Once a call gets upheld instead of reversed, it becomes a reference point. Every future dispute involving that player gets compared back to it. So does every explanation the league gives after that, or doesn't give. Did the league know this one ruling would end up being the benchmark for every argument that followed? Probably not. But that's exactly what happened. Fans caught on fast. Within hours of the ruling, screenshots were already spreading everywhere. Side-by-side comparisons started popping up all over social media, footage of other players doing the same thing, sometimes worse, and walking away with nothing.
A complete accident, no one even knew it happened. It's just unfortunate, but yeah, the league has to do better.
None of those other players were getting anywhere close to the same scrutiny, even for stuff that looked just as physical, just as frustrated. And that question, why one player gets a call reversed while another gets it upheld in the same season, never really went away. It became the lens people used for every technical foul Clark picked up after that. So by the time her sixth technical rolled around, fans weren't just reacting to one bad call. They were reacting to a pattern they'd been tracking since spring. Box score by box score. Screenshot by screenshot. All measured against a trend a lot of them had already decided the league either couldn't see, or just didn't want to deal with. Now, is it fair to call that season-long tracking just fan overreaction? Not really. Not when you look at who else was paying attention. Stephanie White, Indiana's head coach, isn't running some fan account. She's not some anonymous voice online. She's a professional coach who has to be careful about how she talks about officiating, careful not to stir up more tension with the league. And even she, after an earlier technical, told reporters her team needed to have real conversations about being smarter, more strategic, about how fouls were being called against her own player.
Wnba superstar who had 2 cheap shots right there that weren't called.
That detail is worth.
A head coach, on the record, admitting her players' relationship with the league's officiating had turned into something the whole organization had to manage. Not something they figured would just blow over. Not something they were brushing off as internet noise. Something they were actually planning around. And when a coach picks her words that carefully in public, that usually means the pattern underneath is a lot harder to ignore than it looks. National media started noticing too. Some outlets even called it a political tug-of-war. One week, she's the league's biggest star. The next, she's the player facing the strictest discipline. That back and forth in how she's talked about? That's part of the story too. One athlete, painted as both the league's biggest asset and its most punished player, sometimes in the same week. And once that story moved past basketball-specific coverage and into general sports talk, the league started losing control of the narrative. Because once regular fans, people who never even thought about technical foul rules before, started asking why things weren't consistent, the pressure wasn't something any one fan group could contain anymore. Which brings us to the next part of this story. Just how organized that fan tracking really got. When fans started keeping the score. Once the officiating question broke out of niche coverage and into the mainstream, something interesting happened. The tracking didn't slow down with the news cycle. It got sharper. More organized. So let's take a look at exactly where Clark stands in the league's technical foul rankings.
Foul. The Phoenix Mercury's Alyssa Thomas appears to put her fist on Caitlin Clark.
She's tied for second in the whole league. Only one player has more. Why does that ranking matter more than the number itself? Because of who she's sharing that spot with. The players near the top of that list are usually big, physical players. The ones battling in the paint, playing tough defense, getting into hard collisions all game long. That's just their style. It naturally leads to more technicals. But Clark? Her game is about passing, shooting, spacing the floor. Not the rough, physical, emotional stuff. A guard who scores from outside and sets up teammates just doesn't rack up that kind of contact the way a bruising big man does. So why is she sitting in the same disciplinary bracket as players with a totally different style of play? The longer you sit with that question, the harder it is to explain away as coincidence. And that's exactly the kind of thing that makes people look closer, not less. When the league doesn't answer questions like that, fans fill in the blanks themselves. And in this case, their response has been surprisingly organized, even though there's no official system behind it. During Fever games, fans now refresh the box score in real time just to see if a call pushes Clark closer to that suspension line. There are whole threads with screenshots, timestamps, disputed calls. People keep putting her technical fouls side by side with other players who did the same thing, or worse, and didn't face the same consequences. This isn't just fans venting. It's basically an informal fact-checking machine. Organized. Persistent. Not letting a single questionable call slide by unnoticed. Can a league just stay quiet and wait this out? Silence only lasts so long. And the next stretch of this season is going to really test that. Here's what's strange. The most detailed, most consistent record of Clark's disciplinary history isn't coming from the league. The league hasn't explained much of anything. It's coming from a group of fans, totally unaffiliated, just tracking it all themselves. That's not how this usually works. Most of the time, when people question a pattern like this, the league responds. A statement. A rule clarification. Something. Here, the silence has been filled by the very fans the league relies on to keep growing. So what does it mean when a league ends up with a public crowdsourced record of nearly every disciplinary call it makes? Even without an official petition or campaign, that kind of steady, documented attention becomes its own kind of pressure. It doesn't fade after one news cycle. It just keeps building with every new technical foul added to the list. And that's what makes this different from a normal controversy that blows up for a week and disappears. A single viral clip fades fast. But a running, cross-referenced record, updated after every single game, doesn't fade the same way. The longer it exists, the harder it gets to brush off. Every new entry just adds to the pattern. There's a money angle here too, one that hasn't gotten nearly as much attention as the officiating debate, but honestly might matter just as much. The rising cost of every technical foul. Before this season started, the Wnba quietly changed its fine system for technical fouls. Now, a player's 4th through 7th technical each comes with a $1,000 fine. That's a big jump from the old $200 starting point. That rule applies to everyone equally. But equal rules don't always lead to equal results. And the cost of frustration has gone up fast for a player who's closer to a suspension than almost anyone else in the league. Is $1,000 a lot for a pro athlete? Probably not on its own. But that's not really the point. What this fine system really shows is where the priorities are. When the cost of a player's frustration goes up, but the calls causing that frustration stay just as inconsistent, all the pressure lands on the player. It's like raising the price of a reaction instead of fixing what's causing it. And fans, the ones who think the officiating is the real problem here, not Clark's behavior, have definitely noticed that.
Clark owns the WNBA. Every night it is absurd highlight after absurd highlight.
Does making frustration more expensive actually fix inconsistency? Or does it just make inconsistency more expensive to deal with? That's a real distinction, because only one of those actually solves anything. And it raises a bigger question for the whole league. A fine system that gets more expensive over time is basically an incentive system. It's meant to discourage bad behavior by making it cost more. But that only works if the behavior itself is actually the problem. If the real issue is inconsistent officiating, then raising the fines doesn't fix anything. It just makes the symptom more expensive for the player dealing with it most, without ever touching the actual cause. Applied across the whole league, that can look fair on paper. But in practice, it can still land unevenly. And that's exactly what critics of this system are pointing out. So what actually happens if an 8th technical comes? Here's the rule, plain and simple. A 9th technical foul in the regular season means an automatic 1-game suspension. No hearing, no appeal, no way to reconsider it after the fact. For most players, on most teams, in most seasons, that would just be a minor headache. But for this Fever team, right now, it would be a lot more than that. Indiana is 15-10, fighting for playoff position in a conference that's only gotten tougher. And Clark's numbers show exactly why losing her for even 1 game would hurt. She's averaging close to 21 points, about 8 assists, and around 4 rebounds a game. She's not just Indiana's top scorer. She's the whole engine of their offense. The player who opens things up for everyone else. The one whose scoring range forces the other team to change their whole defensive plan. Take her out, and it's not just losing a scorer. The team has to run a completely different offense, with almost no warning. How do you rebuild your entire offensive identity in 48 hours, without months of practice to back it up? You don't. Not cleanly. Not without a cost. And that cost wouldn't stop at wins and losses. Clark's presence has driven up TV numbers, attendance, and a level of national interest women's basketball hasn't always been able to hold on to. Her games sell out. The league itself has said her impact on growth has outpaced anything a marketing campaign could do. So a suspended game wouldn't just be a footnote. It'd cost the league one of its biggest draws, right when interest in the sport is at an all-time high. Clark's call for change. Through all of this, Clark has been careful about how she talks about it. She hasn't framed this as a personal complaint. Instead, she's pointed to something bigger. Replace the league's part-time officiating system with full-time referees. That difference matters more than it seems. She's not asking for special treatment or for calls to go her way. She's saying consistent officiating would help every player in the league. It's a staffing issue, not a personal one. Here's why that matters. A part-time officiating model means referees might not even be working WNBA games as their main job. That can mean less film study, less prep, less consistency training compared to a full-time, dedicated staff. A full-time system would treat officiating like a real career, not something on the side. And that changes a lot more than just one player's foul count. Why does that framing matter so much? Because it shifts the whole debate. Instead of asking, is Clark getting too many technicals? The real question becomes, does the league's officiating system need fixing? That's a much harder claim to brush off without looking like you're dodging an obvious problem. And that puts the league in a tough spot. Ignore the staffing argument, and they look like they're avoiding an easy fix. Act on it, and it takes real time, money, and change that can't happen overnight. And here's where it all backfires. Every time the league has tried to handle this quietly, fines with no comment, technicals upheld with no explanation, it's just created more documentation, not less. Fans have been keeping records since spring. National media coverage has spread way beyond basketball circles and shows no sign of slowing down. And Indiana's own head coach has already gone on record, carefully, but clearly, admitting this is something the team has to manage. That's pressure coming from 3 different directions at once. The player, the media, and an organized, engaged fan base. And so far, the league hasn't given a response that actually settles any of it. Let's be clear about what this pattern does and doesn't prove. The comparisons fans have put together show a real disparity in how calls have been handled. That alone doesn't prove intent, but it does prove the disparity is real, documented again and again by multiple independent sources, with no explanation from the league that puts the question to rest. Will the league actually respond? Or just keep managing this with fines and silence? Because if the fines keep coming without any explanation, silence starts to look like the actual policy. And that gets harder to hold onto the longer the documentation piles up. Whether it's an 8th technical or a 9th, nobody knows yet. But one thing is certain. The disparity, the fine structure, and Clark's call for real change aren't going anywhere. And the league still hasn't given an answer. None of this started with a big stat line or one bad screen. It started back in June, with one upheld call that fans refused to just let go. And every fine since then has just added to the record they've been building. Clark hasn't complained. She's asked for a fix that would help every player in the league, which is exactly why the league can't just quietly ignore it. This is the moment silence stopped working. Whether the answer comes before an 8th technical, or after a 9th, that documentation isn't disappearing anytime soon.